Hello, and welcome to The Sleepy Owl, a cozy nook where you can gently unwind and drift into a peaceful night's rest. Tonight, we're sharing another soothing story, one that can help settle your mind and foster a feeling of quiet calm. But first, let's take a moment to prepare our bodies and minds for a tranquil, rejuvenating sleep. Settle in comfortably, and with each slow inhale and gentle exhale, allow the day's worries to gradually fade away. It can be challenging to pull away from the day's busyness, particularly as bedtime approaches. Yet remember, the less we stress over falling asleep quickly, the easier it becomes for our minds to release any tension. Let the gentle rhythm of your breath carry off lingering concerns, and let tonight's story be your guide toward deep relaxation. Now make yourself comfortable and let the warmth of the sleepy owl envelop you. Enjoy the story, and may you find a restful, peaceful slumber here in our little nighttime sanctuary. There was a merchant named Laurent who once risked his entire wealth on a fleet of ships, only to lose them all at sea. As a widower, he did not have to face the burden of delivering the news to a wife, but he did have 6 children who were accustomed to a life of luxury. When the debts were called in and word spread that the family was destitute, most of them struggled to cope. With each passing day without the ship's return to the harbor, the merchant had to start selling off their lavish furniture, carriage, and even his daughter's jewelry and expensive garments. They had to abandon their grand house and relocate to a modest cottage on the town's outskirts. Laurent was frequently away, seeking support from business contacts and potential investors to help him revive his business. During his absences, his 3 sons and 3 daughters, who were nearly adults, were left to manage the household on their own. The boys and the 2 eldest girls, accustomed to a life of leisure and study, were largely inept at practical tasks. The youngest daughter, Camille, took on the responsibility of household chores willingly. Whether due to her younger age or her gentle and steadfast nature, Camille made efforts to learn the essentials of running a household. Camille, who was well liked by the villagers, sought guidance from them on unfamiliar tasks such as baking, sewing, gardening, and raising chickens. Initially cautious, the villagers grew fond of her eagerness to learn and work hard. Over time, Camille became the pillar that held Laurent's family together. While the older siblings struggled to come to terms with their circumstances, Camille ensured the home was orderly and meals were provided. Nearly 2 years into this new way of life, Laurent received news that one of his lost ships had reappeared in the harbor, with most of its cargo intact. The family celebrated this miraculous turn of events. The older siblings were eager to leave their life among the villagers behind. Camille shared in their joy, but the news did not hold the same significance for her. She had grown fond of their humble cottage, with its neat garden and the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. Although she was pleased to see her family happy, she was uncertain about returning to their former life of idleness. She had discovered a sense of fulfillment in being of service. In order to retrieve his property, Laurent had to journey to the port on horseback, a trip that would take a couple of days. Once there, he could arrange for the proper distribution of his reclaimed wealth and hire a comfortable coach for the journey back home. In anticipation of their improved circumstances, he inquired of each of his children what gift they desired from the city. The older siblings requested luxury items: silk shoes with sparkling buckles, hats with intricate embellishments, velvet capes, bears, and jewels. Camille, on the other hand, remained silent, appearing deep in thought about her desired gift. When her father prompted her to share, she hesitated momentarily. "Honestly, Father, I have always longed to see a rose," she confessed. "They do not grow in our region, and they are so rare and costly. A single rose in any hue would be delightful if you could bring one for me." He chuckled at his youngest child's peculiar request, but readily agreed. Privately, he considered including a necklace or some other trinket to accompany the flower. The weather was pleasant on the morning of his departure. Camille took care to pack his saddlebag with provisions for the journey and bid him farewell with a slightly teary smile. The others were less sentimental. They were accustomed to their father's travels and were solely interested in the gifts they anticipated upon his return. As he rode off along the sunlit forest path, Camille stood alone in front of the cottage until he vanished from sight. She felt a strange sense of unease, but chose to remain silent. After all, their fortune seemed to be on the rise. While Laurent's children awaited his return at the cottage, he steadily made his way to the port city, filled with hope of regaining his wealth and standing. It was true that he had suffered significant losses. Nonetheless, with the cargo on that ship, he could start a new business, possibly leading to a new fleet of ships. His mind was brimming with visions of the spices, silks, and other goods he could import in the future. Thus, it was crushing for him to arrive and discover his aspirations shattered. Indeed, the ship had returned with most of its cargo intact. However, news of his good fortune had spread rapidly, prompting his numerous creditors to act swiftly. By the time Laurent arrived to claim his possessions, they had already been distributed to settle his many debts. Despite his efforts to negotiate with various merchants for an extension on his substantial bills, it was to no avail. By day's end, he was a man free of debts, but empty-handed. There was no capital left for him to invest, and certainly no funds to fulfill the promises of gifts he had made to his family. He was so disheartened that he didn't even want to stay in the city overnight. Without properly provisioning himself, considering the weather, or sending any correspondence ahead of him, Laurent mounted his tired horse again and rode out of town, heading back down the provincial road that had brought him to the port that morning. Laurent was a few hours outside of the city when darkness fell and a storm descended. Lightning and thunder crashed all around him, and the wind gusted mercilessly, blowing limbs off the trees. Laurent's horse became frightened and bolted away from the main road, taking him into an unfamiliar forest. Realizing too late that he had been foolish to undertake this nighttime journey, Laurent began searching in the gusting wind for any sort of shelter, such as a cave. How long his horse wandered through the howling gale, he did not know. Finally, he saw a tall stone wall arise before him. He urged the horse onward, hoping he had reached a house where he might shelter. Arriving at the forbidding wall of rock, he saw that it was not a house. It was the wall around an estate. A tall and imposing iron gate stood ever so slightly open. Having no time for good manners, Laurent dismounted and pushed the heavy swinging gate wider to pull his horse through. Together, They slowly headed up a paved walkway that receded ahead of them into the swirling darkness. With leaves flying all around and rain pelting him from all sides, Laurent could barely see the massive structure that emerged ahead of him in the wicked gloom. It was a mansion, to be sure. Although his visibility was limited, he could see it had a grand approach and many large rooms with tall windows. It was a very intimidating place for a person to arrive uninvited. But he had no choice. He feared he could not survive the night without a roof over his head. Tying his horse up safely in a sheltered alcove, he walked to the massive front door and lifted the iron door knocker. He let it fall, hearing the sound echo through the gloom as if in response to the thunder. When there was no answer, he took a deep breath and pushed the door inward with all his weight. It gave, and he found himself almost falling onto the floor of a grand entryway. Laurent lay on the cold flagstones for a moment, regaining his breath in the eerie stillness. He could still hear the rain lashing the front steps through the crack in the tall door, and thought to himself how glad he was that he had found shelter for his horse. Rising in the semi-darkness, he appeared about him. He was in a grand reception area with a curved staircase ascending on either side. Suits of armor stood sentinel here and there. Ahead of him, there was a set of richly carved double doors. The silence within the house was profound, so much so that one could have heard a pin drop. However, there was a faint light seeping through the cracks of the doors ahead. Despite making a few half-hearted attempts to call out to whoever was inside, he eventually took a deep breath and proceeded towards the illuminated room, slowly pushing the doors open. Stepping inside, he surveyed the scene. A blazing fire in the expansive hearth, a table set for one with simple dishes, a carafe, and a large drinking glass arranged upon it. His eyes wandered to other features of the cozy room, noting upholstered chairs and tables cluttered with books. Yet there was no trace of the homeowner. Awkwardly settling into one of the armchairs, Laurent waited for a brief moment. However, he soon found himself unable to resist the temptation of the meal laid out on the table. The sight of the loaf of bread and the aroma of the roasted meat tantalized him, causing his stomach to audibly growl as time passed without anyone appearing. Succumbing to his hunger, he seated himself at the table, starting with a slice of bread and gradually consuming the entire feast. An hour slipped by in contented silence, with Laurent assuming the owner must be away, seeking refuge from the storm elsewhere. Savoring a deep sip of the delectable liquid in the glass, he eagerly finished the remaining food. Convinced that the owner was absent and that he could clarify matters in the morning, Laurent leaned back in his chair after polishing off all the food and emptied the carafe. The crackling fire provided a comforting warmth as he drained the last of the liquid from his glass, retrieving the letter regarding his recovered cargo ship from his pocket. Once brimming with hope, his dreams had now dissipated. Unconsciously pushing the letter away on the table, he drifted into a deep slumber. Throughout the night, he slept soundly without any dreams. Upon awakening in the morning, it took a moment for Laurent to recollect his surroundings. The fire had long extinguished, and the dishes and glasses from the previous night remained on the table, indicating that the homeowner had not yet returned. Feeling embarrassed for intruding into a stranger's abode, Laurent's discomfort overwhelmed him. Instead of waiting for the homeowner's return, he decided to depart discreetly and swiftly. Rationalizing that the uneaten dinner would have gone to waste regardless, he rose from the armchair, crossed the room, and opened the double doors. Dim light filtered into the entryway, illuminating the austere hallway more clearly than the night before. Entering the foyer cautiously, he found himself carefully navigating between the vigilant suits of armor, half expecting them to spring to life and block his way. Surveying the twin carving staircases, he noticed the neglected and fussy carpet runners, giving the impression that the place had been uninhabited for quite some time. Approaching the massive front door, he grasped the handles, pulled with all his strength, and slowly pushed it open, revealing a misty courtyard beyond. After slipping through the crack and closing the door behind him, he adjusted his waistcoat, trying to regain composure. Although leaving the forbidding refuge felt unsettling, he resolved to leave the humiliating journey behind. Quickly returning to the alcove where his horse had been tethered the night before, he was relieved to find her in good condition. Retrieving an apple from his saddlebag, a remnant from the supplies Camille had packed, he fed it to the horse. Untying the horse, he led her quietly along the stone path he had traveled through the windy night. Glancing back, he saw the imposing mansion looming in the growing daylight, a vast chateau, long, beige, and rectangular, with a central section flanked by identical wings on each side. The tall, narrow windows on the two large floors gave the building a regimented look, as if they were watching him. The thickly chimneyed, sloping, tiled roof added to the grandeur. Turning his gaze away from the mansion, he guided the horse towards the front gate, passing overgrown gardens on either side. Approaching the end of the pathway, he noticed a charming pergola covered in rose bushes. In the center of a circular seating area stood a rose bush adorned with the most exquisite pink roses he had ever seen. Remembering his promise to Camille, he decided to gather the roses as a token of his commitment. With a knife from his bag, he carefully cut all the blushing roses from the bush, intent on taking them all. Lost in his task, he failed to hear approaching footsteps. As he stepped back from the now bare bush, he felt a presence watching him. Turning around, he saw a stern-looking figure glaring at him. The individual, resembling a human, but with a wild beard and an unusually tall, muscular frame, appeared angry. Clearly caught off guard, the man was dressed in rumpled linen attire, giving the impression of having rushed over in haste. His expression conveyed fury. "What do you think you are doing?" he growled loudly, resembling a wolf. Laurent stood frozen, acutely aware of the bouquet in his left hand. He stammered out an excuse, explaining that he believed nobody resided there and assumed the roses wouldn't be missed. Seeing no change in the man's intimidating expression, he weakly added that he had promised some roses to his daughter. The man in the linen shirt, with a beastly demeanor, waited in silence, seemingly pondering his next words. Standing tall, he declared, "You took advantage of my hospitality without permission. You dined at my table, you slept in my chair. I was willing to overlook all of this without confronting you. However, you have now taken every bloom from my most cherished rose bush. They hold great personal significance to me, irreplaceable and invaluable. I insist that you make amends for this." Upon hearing this, Laurent's heart sank. He shook his head in resignation, admitting that he had nothing to offer in repayment. The stern host regarded him calmly. "In that case, you must work to settle your debt," he stated. "I require workers here on my property." Laurent stared at him, attempting to propose an alternative. "But, sir," he objected, "I have 6 children at home. I cannot stay here. What will happen to them?" The man remained unmoved. "Either you work off your debt, or someone from your family must take your place," he insisted. "Take your roses. They are of no use to me now. Go back to your family and make arrangements. I expect you or a substitute to be here within a week. If you fail to appear, I will find you." With that, the stern man turned and walked toward the house, not looking back. Laurent watched him vanish into the chateau. He saw no choice but to return home and inform his children of his actions. He was unsure how, but he needed to plan for their well-being during his absence. Perhaps once the man had calmed down, he would reconsider and not keep Laurent in his service for too long. With the storm past and daylight on his side, Laurent retraced his steps to the main road and rode steadily towards home. As he pondered the news he had to deliver, he moved at a slow pace. The day was beautiful, with the mist lifting and the early autumn sun shining warmly. The birds sang joyfully, oblivious to the turmoil, but Laurent's heart was heavy, filled with apprehension about what lay ahead. He arrived home late that night. His children greeted him with excitement. After all, they were expecting gifts. Opening and closing his saddlebags, they playfully reached around to find the finery he had promised them. With regret, he instead offered each of them a rose. Camille took hers and smelled it with delight, admiring its perfection. But his other 5 children demanded to see their real presents. That night, around the crowded kitchen table, Laurent told his children what had happened on his ill-fated journey to the port city. He related the loss of his remaining fortune, as well as the circumstances leading up to his current obligation to the owner of the mysterious chateau. When he concluded that he would have to return and work off his debt, the 5 oldest siblings were not pleased. They pouted, asking how they were supposed to manage in his absence. Camille alone was silent. She sat at the table with an unreadable expression, lost in thought. Finally, she called for silence. Her siblings looked at her with surprise, as Camille was usually not one to insert her opinion. Camille announced that she would return to the chateau to take her father's place. Laurent's eyes filled with tears. He protested that he could not and would not allow such a thing. However, Camille's sound reasoning was difficult to counter. Father was needed at home to support the family. She, however, could be spared. Furthermore, she did have some household skills and would be able to do whatever cleaning or cooking was allotted to her. No, she concluded, there was not another reasonable solution. She was who would work off the family debt. It took a day or 2 for Camille to prepare her modest belongings for the journey. As the rose her father brought her began to wilt, she pressed it in a book to dry. She wanted to have a reminder of why she was leaving home to work for this beastly stranger on a distant and isolated estate. Camille was nervous about leaving behind everything she had known, but she was determined to make her father proud. The morning of Camille's departure dawned bright and clear. She and Laurent packed her things into a small cart that they hitched to their faithful mare. The chateau would be 2 days' walk, with the horse pulling the cart. Laurent knew of an inn where they could spend the night along the way. Her 4 remaining siblings gathered in front of the cottage to see them off. Among them, there was a mixture of relief and unspoken admiration. They were glad that they would not be left to fend for themselves for very long. It was a somber journey for Laurent and Camille. The fine weather lasted all the first day, and their night at an inn was uneventful. The second day of their journey turned out to be blustery and somber as autumn began to make its presence felt in the forest. The first brown leaves had fallen and were being blown across their path while the wind whistled through the trees. Their loyal mare moved slowly along the road, bringing them closer to their impending separation. When Laurent noticed the turnoff from the main road leading to the chateau, his heart ached more with each step. Sensing her father's despondency, Camille gathered her courage and offered him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, father," she said in a soothing tone. "I am capable. I will manage." He nodded, hoping her words would prove true. Eventually, they reached the gloomy entrance of the estate. Laurent knew the moment had arrived. Once again, he pushed open the gate, guiding the horse through the entrance towards the imposing mansion. Camille gazed openly at the sight before her. The lush, overgrown gardens and the towering, formidable walls of the house surpassed anything she had ever seen. It was overwhelming, yet striking in its darkness. Coming from a village upbringing, Camille was left speechless by the sheer magnitude of the place, feeling the weight of its mystery and enduring presence. The stones themselves seemed to be in a deep slumber, as if they had long awaited rediscovery. She pondered the tasks that awaited her here, hoping they were within her capabilities. Having been the caretaker of a modest cottage, Laurent halted the horse and cart upon reaching the broad front steps, where the wind blew fiercely, seemingly trying to push them away from the entrance. They ascended slowly. Laurent raised the heavy door knocker and let it fall. Father and daughter stood at the steps, waiting for the formidable master of the house to appear. To their surprise, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a young boy. He seemed to be around 13 years old, dressed plainly in villager attire. Peering out with frank curiosity, he examined the pair before nodding in approval. "Is one of you the new servant?" he inquired. Laurent was momentarily surprised, but indicated that he had brought his daughter Camille, who would be working in his place to repay a debt. The boy nodded, as if this was entirely expected, and pulled the door open wider, gesturing for her to enter. With that, the voice scuttled off into the recesses of the house, presumably to announce that the new servant waited with the wind at her back. Camille walked through the doorway and into her new life. It was an emotional parting for Laurent and Camille, but they both put on a brave face. The faithful mare turned homeward, the sullen skies weighing down on them, and did not look back until they were outside the gates of the chateau. Then the swaying trees of the forest closed in behind them. Camille stood uncertainly in the echoing hallway. The gray light of the overcast day made its way into the room via tall windows above the door, but it did nothing to create a feeling of warmth. She suppressed a shiver, edging closer to the trunk, that held her belongings. She told herself she would need to muster her courage and do her best. After a few minutes, the boy came running back into the hall and announced to her that the Baron had told him to take her to her room. With that, he cheerfully picked up her trunk and began lugging it up the large curving staircase. Camille followed him, surprised that she was going up instead of down to a kitchen or lower room. Perhaps she would be lodging in the attic. To her surprise, the boy turned down the first grand hallway they padded along the richly carpeted east wing of the chateau. Their silent steps moved past staring portraits of nobles from bygone eras. It was as if they were a permanent residence, and this strange girl was an unexpected intruder. Camille was so busy looking at them that she almost collided with the boy when he finally stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. Camille followed him inside and was surprised to find herself standing in the most well-appointed bedroom she'd ever seen. It was not overly large, and the furnishings were sober, but the canopied bed, the fine fabrics, and the rich wood trim were very luxurious. While she surveyed the room, noting a cozy window seat and small dressing table, the boy announced and started a fire in the grate. When it was crackling, he stood and dusted off his hands, grinning at her. "I'm Gabriel," he said, "and I help the Baron out around here with this and that. I'm so glad you've come. It does get a bit solitary sometimes, and I could use some help with the day-to-day." Camille wasn't sure how to respond. Although she wondered what exactly the day-to-day was, instead, she thanked him for the fire and asked when she would be meeting her new employer. Gabriel informed her that the Baron had indicated he would see her tomorrow, and that he'd explain her duties then. For now, the boy would be bringing her a simple supper, and hoped she would rest well for the night. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Gabriel left the room and closed the door silently behind him. Camille collected herself and began the task of unpacking her belongings. She hung her clothes in the spacious wardrobe and placed her few books carefully on a side table next to the bed. Opening the top volume, she noticed a pink rose tucked between the pages, causing a wistful smile to form on her face. After closing the book and setting it aside, she walked over to the window, drew back the heavy drapes, and settled into the plush cushions of the window seat. From this vantage point, she had a panoramic view of the courtyard, where the gardens sprawled untamed along the pathways and up the stone walls of the chateau. Dusk was approaching, and the wind swirled debris across the paved yard, creating small whirlwinds here and there. Dark clouds hurried past the ascending moon. Overwhelmed by the journey and the unfamiliarity of her new surroundings, she drifted off briefly, enveloped by the curtains. A knock on her door roused her from her nap. Disentangling herself from the window seat, she regulated her breathing and opened the door. A tray awaited her outside, bearing a simple dinner of bread, cheese, soup, and hot tea. Surveying the hallway, she saw no one in sight. Gabriel moved with stealth, that much was evident. Bringing the tray inside, she placed it on a small table near the fireplace. Her hunger was intense, and she devoured every morsel. With little preparation for bed, she pulled back the coverlet, slipped into the comforting warmth of her sheets and pillow, and swiftly succumbed to sleep. During the night, Camille experienced peculiar dreams. She envisioned herself wandering the dim corridors of the chateau, trailing a large dog that vanished into various rooms only to reappear moments later in the hallway. Attempting to catch up with the animal, she arrived at a doorway where it had recently disappeared. Peering into the room, she did not see the dog, but instead caught sight of a man's back as he sat at a desk. Before he could fully turn around to face her, she awoke. Sitting up in bed, she noticed the dwindling fire and the sun streaming through her window. As her initial confusion lifted, a knock sounded at her door. Gabriel stood outside with a tray in hand. "Good morning, Miss Mila," he greeted politely. "I have brought you some breakfast." Gesturing towards the entrance, he informed her, "The Baron wishes to see you in his study once you have finished." Camille nodded at the boy, accepted the tray, and watched as he disappeared once more. An hour later, Camilla stood nervously at the door of the very room where her father had once eaten his stolen fireside dinner. Camille could hear paper shuffling around inside. She cleared her throat and knocked lightly on the door. The noises stopped, and she heard a chair scraping across the floor. Momentarily, a man with a copious amount of facial hair appeared. His features were unattractively prominent, and his face appeared to wear a natural scowl. He was a truly alarming sight, but Camille took care not to reveal her feelings. He dipped her head politely in greeting. The huge man peered at her appraisingly and nodded his ungainly head in return. Then he gestured for her to be seated in a chair by the fire. He lowered himself into the armchair opposite. "See that you are the one to work off your father's debt," he said. "Are you familiar with basic household tasks, such as cleaning and some cooking?" Camille nodded, indicating that she was. The man appeared pleased by this. He lifted a heavy ring of keys off a nearby table. "As you can see, I am very short on help here," he said. "Gabriel takes care of my basic needs. His mother keeps me provisioned with bread, milk, and eggs each day, and he runs errands to town. But there is nobody else to manage the estate other than myself. I'm sure you can tell that by looking around. It's still too much work, just you and Gabriel, but we will make do." He paused as if waiting for a reply. Camille was aghast at the idea of being the only housekeeper in this huge mansion, but she didn't think there was a point in saying so. The man continued, "These keys will open most rooms in the house, although there is little reason to use many of them. If you need something that Gabriel cannot get for you, please speak to me. Otherwise, I am not particular and would like you to make as many household decisions for yourself as possible. I spend most of my time in my study or in the library." Overwhelmed by the enormity of the job he was giving her, Camille could only nod, indicating that the interview was at an end. He stood abruptly. Camille rose from her seat, took the ancient-looking keys from him, and nodded. Then, as she made her way out of the room, he called after her, "Dinner is at 7 p.m. It would be very sensible if you would join me in the dining room." Camille bobbed her head, thanked him, and left the study. She stood somewhat bewildered in the echoing front hall, feeling at once that she was lost in it and also that it was closing in on her. Spreading the heavy keys across her open palm, she gazed at them reflectively. She didn't know what doors they opened, but they held a quiet aura of authority about them. She was stirred from her reverie by the sight of Gabriel emerging from the shadows. Grinning brightly in her direction, he asked if she would like a tour. She gratefully accepted, and so her adventure of being the housekeeper at the chateau began. What Camille learned was that the employer lived alone and had done so for many years due to his fierce appearance, which made the people in the surrounding area fear him. They whispered unkind stories and treated him rudely when he appeared in public. Gabriel was the only person who connected him to the outside world. He had started by running errands for the Baron years ago, but he had soon grown to love and appreciate the man behind the unapproachable facade. He assured Camille that the Baron's bark was worse than his bite. Now Gabriel spent every day at the house, attending to whatever necessities he could. At night, he returned to his family's modest home on the outskirts of town. "Truly, miss," he insisted, "the Baron is a fair and kind-hearted man." Gabriel led Camille on a tour of the numerous rooms and corridors of the entire chateau, which had been neglected in most areas. Along the dim hallways were unused bedrooms draped in dust sheets. The fireplaces lay cold, some rooms untouched for decades or even centuries. Furniture and belongings were stacked high in those places, covered in cobwebs. The windows barely let in light from outside, their glass coated in years of grime. As Camille discovered, there were only a few rooms that saw daily use, and she resolved to clean and organize those. These included the kitchen, the Baron's study, and the front entryway. However, the most magnificent room was the library. Gabriel allowed Camille a glimpse into the library while the Baron was occupied elsewhere, and she was amazed. A vast room with lofty ceilings and gold accents unfolded before her. Bookshelves extended all the way to the ceiling, lining every inch of every wall except where windows were situated. Rolling ladders stood at each end of the room, poised to glide along the bookcases and grant access to any volume desired. The sheer number of volumes was overwhelming. With spines in various hues of crimson, forest green, navy blue, and brown, each book beckoned to be plucked from the shelf and perused at leisure. Camille, an avid reader, despite only owning a few books from her father's financial downfall, had never encountered or even imagined a collection like this one. According to Gabriel, the Baron spent a significant amount of time in the library, a fact that seemed evident. Tables throughout this opulent sanctuary were laden with tomes left open to specific pages or grouped together, while well-worn leather armchairs hinted at the long hours spent turning their weighty pages. Gabriel solemnly instructed her to always keep the fire burning in the hearth during the day. Camille envisioned the experience of opening one of these countless volumes and sinking into a plush chair, inhaling the scent of aged, ink-laden paper. It was enthralling. Camille realized that the only way to make headway in this neglected house was to simply pick a spot and begin. On that initial day, she and Gabriel dusted and aired the front hall and cleaned the kitchen. Gabriel and the Baron had been preparing simple meals there for a long time, but a considerable portion of the space required attention. Camille wasn't a culinary expert, but she found joy in restoring the kitchen's shine. She dispatched Gabriel to town with a list of supplies to procure. Then, standing in the grand, silent kitchen, she set to work. Unused countertops were cleared of dust, pots and pans were polished, and the cold, empty space gradually regained vitality. By the time she was ready to dine with the Baron, she had cooked a modest meal of roasted chicken. It wasn't elaborate, but she felt proud of it. As she approached the window to draw the curtains for the night, she paused and gazed out into the darkness. The courtyard lay silent, as if anticipating something. Nothing moved, not even a bird. The grounds seemed enveloped in a spell of quietness. She carefully drew the velvet curtains together and tore her gaze away from the window. There was much to discover about this place, she mused. Lighting a candle, she proceeded down the dimly lit hallway and descended the broad staircase, the tall doors of the dining room. The space was exceedingly grand for just two individuals. It had likely hosted lavish parties and formal dinners. Looking up, she admired the sparkling crystal chandelier that hung over the room like a starry canopy. Gabriel had set two places at one end of the long table, and dinner was ready. She was the first to arrive. She didn't have to wait long. The Baron's imposing figure awkwardly appeared in the doorway. He paused and briefly nodded in greeting. Then he gestured towards the two place settings, indicating she should take a seat. Camille gladly settled into one of the upholstered chairs. "I see you've been hard at work with Gabriel today," the Baron remarked, raising his eyebrows at the hearty meal she had prepared. "He has carried a heavy burden as my sole help these past years. I'm pleased you're here to share some of his responsibilities." Camille nodded, unsure how to respond. "My lord," she began and paused. When he shook his head, "Please, you may simply call me Antoine," he replied. "I am lord of nothing now, just the lord of this chateau and its collection of dusty relics," he quipped darkly. Then, gazing into her eyes, he said, "I apologize for the circumstances that brought you here, but I hope you will find comfort. I strive to be fair, and I am pleased to have your company." Camille nodded and briefly smiled. "Would you like me to organize the library tomorrow?" she inquired. "I wasn't sure if you wanted me to enter." After a moment of contemplation, the Baron nodded, approving her suggestion. He then added, "Feel free to borrow any book you wish from the library. As Descartes said, reading good books is akin to conversing with the greatest minds of the past. You will discover that my library holds a vast collection, encompassing almost any book you can think of. It is quite magical in that respect." Taken aback by his generous gesture and cultured demeanor, Camille observed her somewhat unassuming employer as he dined. Having arrived at the chateau just a day ago, her perspective on her circumstances had already begun to shift. She now found herself the mistress of a grand residence with the freedom to work as she pleased, along with the privilege of access to an extensive library. It seemed that perhaps her fortunes were not as bleak as she had initially feared. Quietly contemplating her plate in the soft glow of the fire, she could only hear the gentle clinking of silverware against china. Throughout the dinner, the Baron and Camille exchanged few words, choosing instead to finish their meal in respectful silence. Later, as she lay comfortably nestled in the luxurious sheets of her canopy bed, Camille felt a sense of optimism. This secluded estate held many intriguing secrets, and she eagerly anticipated uncovering them in due time. Rolling over onto her side, she drowsily regarded the tightly drawn drapes shutting out the darkness beyond the window. Within the walls of the chateau, a warmth emanated, a flame that seemed to keep the place alive. She could sense it. The following day, After attending to the kitchen, Camille cautiously made her way to the library. Knowing the Baron was occupied in his study, she saw an opportunity to explore the magnificent collection of books under the guise of cleaning. Armed with a duster, she meticulously navigated around the bookshelves and tables, diligently addressing neglected surfaces that had gathered dust over time. Just as she was about to shift a stack of books, Antoine appeared in the doorway. "Please refrain from disturbing any stacks or opening books," he requested. Apologizing, Camille stepped back from the pile she had touched. "No need to apologize," he reassured her. "I understand it may seem disorganized. I am in the midst of research and prefer not to lose my place." Then he inquired if she had selected a book for herself. She replied that she had not, and asked for his recommendations. Camille confessed that she felt inadequate to comprehend such significant works, coming from a less educated background than him. Antoine smiled, gestured widely, stating, "Recognizing one's ignorance is the first step towards wisdom." Noticing her confusion, he playfully winked and mentioned that this piece of wisdom was attributed to Socrates. Crossing the room, he retrieved a small volume from a lower shelf and handed it to her carefully. "Perhaps you might enjoy some of his other ideas. He believed strongly in the importance of asking questions." Camille accepted the book with a grateful nod. "I was about to leave the room," she began, but then paused and indicated that she did have a question after all. "Would it be possible for me to hire some villagers to tidy up the gardens before winter?" she inquired. Antoine gazed at her somewhat sadly and shrugged. "If Gabriel can find anyone willing to come onto the estate, you are welcome to do so. Unfortunately, most are hesitant to enter the chateau grounds due to outlandish tales that have circulated about me over the years, leaving me mostly isolated." Camille furrowed her brow. "How do you endure it? Doesn't it anger you to be treated unfairly?" Le Baron looked down thoughtfully and replied, "I was once a vain and foolish man, more handsome but blinded by my own vanity. It took a great misfortune for me to realize my mistakes and the contempt people hold for me. Perhaps this is just the consequence of my past folly." Camille remained silent, deciding not to ask further questions that day, but resolved to uncover more about her employer's unfortunate circumstances. For now, she looked forward to reading Socrates in her room after dinner. Camille quickly adapted to her new role as the chateau's housekeeper and even grew to cherish it. Through some persuasion, she convinced Gabriel to hire a few men from the village who arrived one day to restore the neglected gardens with strict instructions from Camille to preserve the rose bush near the pergola, planted by Antoine's mother and of great sentimental value to him. She almost regretted bringing the village men to the estate when she overheard them disparaging Antoine. "He's a complete monster," one of them loudly declared. "Lives like a wild animal in there," added another. "No manners and not fit for human interaction, but I'll take his money," the man concluded rudely. Camille noticed Antoine standing by the window, overhearing the entire conversation. She hurried to shut it, eager to shield him from the men's cruelty. He waved her off, appearing unfazed. "I've grown accustomed to such talk," he remarked. "It has been many years since I could socialize in society." Camille remained upset, nonetheless. "How can you endure such unfairness? People who don't even know you, how do you not despise them?" she inquired. He shrugged, looking thoughtfully at a stack of books on a nearby table. A great English playwright named William Shakespeare once wrote, "Not a furnace for your foe so hot that it do singe yourself by bearing good will for these unknowing people, I ease the burden on myself." With a smile and a nod at Camille, he remarked, "You might enjoy reading Shakespeare yourself. He wrote some excellent plays." With that, he turned back to his stack of books, leaving Camille to ponder his words and the gloomy day outside. Despite the considerable amount of work awaiting her each day, Camille still managed to explore the house. As autumn settled in with its crisp days, early sunsets, and chilly evenings, she would wander the corridors with a candle, using her heavy ring of house keys to unlock the myriad closed doors that lined the halls. Most of them turned out to be bedrooms. It was evident that this country chateau had once accommodated many distinguished guests of the nobility. Now draped in dust sheets, one dim room after another, unveiled elegant four-poster beds, luxurious furniture, and dusty fabric-covered chairs. One day, she stumbled upon what seemed to be a very special room. It had clearly been a lady's chamber, unlike the others. However, it was still brimming with her possessions. A graceful dressing table was adorned with jars of powder and twinkling perfume bottles in the afternoon sunlight. Elaborate wigs from decades past sat nearby on their own stands, as if awaiting a grand ball. Upon opening the wardrobe, Camille was amazed to find a row of opulent silk dresses in the style of the pre-Revolution era. She gently ran her hand over their delicate skirts, almost afraid they would disintegrate in her fingers. She envisioned the elegant woman who must have donned them. Upon opening the chest of drawers, she discovered it was filled with glittering necklaces. Inside a small velvet container, there was a ring adorned with a twinkling sapphire. Camille closed the box and quietly slid the drawer shut, careful not to give the impression of stealing. Regretfully, she exited the room and locked it once more. The contents felt like a gateway to happier times and were the most beautiful things she had seen in the house. Camille diligently wrote letters to her father, which Gabriel would take to town during his errands. In these letters, she reassured him that she was being treated well and enjoyed her work. Eventually, she even started sending him some money. After her first month, the Baron informed her that he couldn't allow her to continue working without compensation, as the damage to the rose bush had been adequately rectified. He expressed his desire for her to stay and offered her a weekly salary for her efforts. Camille accepted with gratitude. Serving as Antoine's housekeeper, she felt she had found her true calling. Her organizational skills were put to good use, and the pleasant company and access to his remarkable library became her primary sources of joy. Despite Antoine's reputation for being unattractive, Camille made sure his attire was well maintained and presentable. Occasionally, she would catch glimpses of a normal, handsome man in the mirror as he passed by or during conversations, only to refocus and see his original, fearsome appearance. It seemed as though the chateau's dark magic was playing tricks on her mind. With a hint of amusement, she noted that beggars would occasionally arrive at the door, unaware of the estate's notoriety in her hometown. Back home, beggars were often turned away and received little assistance, as the townspeople believed they brought misfortune upon themselves, and that hard-working individuals did not end up in such destitution. Camille had expected Antoine to dismiss them, but instead he surprised her by asking her to keep the beautiful coins before they departed. Curious, Camille inquired about his unexpected act of generosity, especially since no one in the vicinity had shown him any kindness. Antoine once again mentioned a philosopher he admired, Aristotle, quoting, "It is the characteristic of the magnanimous man to ask no favor, but to be ready to do kindness to others." Regretfully, he acknowledged, "I must learn to be a more magnanimous man because it is my past actions that led me astray." Although Camille couldn't extract further details from him at that moment, she was eager to unravel Antoine's story. That night, they engaged in a friendly conversation in the candlelit dining room while enjoying a hearty winter stew. It was then that Camille gathered the courage to inquire about Antoine's solitude at the chateau. Antoine hesitated, sighed deeply, leaned back in his chair, and began to recount his tale. "Years ago, I resided here with my mother. My father's demise at a young age led me to inherit this estate. I cherished my mother, a vibrant and kind-hearted soul who was adored by all. It was her rose bush that your father despoiled of its flowers." Antoine paused uncomfortably before continuing. "After my mother fell ill and passed away, I was left to my own devices. Regrettably, I did not conduct myself well. Inexperienced and foolish, I squandered our wealth on frivolous luxuries and extravagant gatherings. I neglected the estate, left debts unpaid, and mistreated my staff. Without my mother's guidance, I spiraled into a life of worthlessness, failing to serve anyone, including myself. One evening, my servant informed me of a woman seeking food and alms at the door. Engaged in a lavish festivity, I callously instructed him to advise her to seek employment elsewhere. However, before the servant could escort her away, she forced her way inside and pronounced a curse upon me for my vanity and folly. She foretold a future of solitude and lovelessness, with the key to redemption lying in humanity. Perplexed, Camille questioned, "Humanity? What did she mean by that?" Antoine shrugged. "This enigma has haunted me for years. My library is filled with the wisdom of philosophers, mathematicians, and poets, yet the answer to my plight remains elusive. Despite my intellectual growth, humanity's brilliance has not yet provided a solution to my predicament." Camille regarded him from across the table. She could hear the light crackling of the fire punctuating the silence, and imagined him sitting before many fires for a long time without anyone to talk to. She wondered how many years he'd been trapped here in this solitary prison, turning the pages of countless books in his library, searching for redemption. Antoine smiled brightly in an attempt to break the awkward silence. "Oh well," he added. "Thus, the excellent Isaac Newton said, 'To arrive at the simplest truth requires years of contemplation.' One of these days, I may yet find the answer lying cowled up on her bed that night." Camille felt she had finally put the pieces together. All these years, Antoine had spent his time studying, thinking, absorbing, and repenting. He was no longer a man who would refuse kindness to even the undeserving. She did wonder what else there was that he could do. Would he forever be trapped here with his books and the dusty souvenirs of the regrettable person he used to be? She hoped not, because she had really come to admire him. She pulled the covers tied her around her chin and gazed drowsily at the remnants of the fire glowing in the hearth. Surrounded by the silence of the house, she slept for another night. All through the crisp, deep freeze of winter, Camille and Antoine went about their lives at the chateau in pleasant companionship with Gabriel as their faithful connection to the outside world. Many of the rooms in the enormous mansion stayed locked and unused. The part of the house the trio needed for their daily activities was snug and clean thanks to Camille's faithful management. Meals were simple but hearty. The blinding white snow piled high in the courtyard, and sometimes the bleak wind whistled in the abandoned passages. But the inhabitants of the chateau stayed close to the fireplaces, buried in their books. At last, the first signs of spring arrived with it. Camille received a letter from her father. He said her oldest sister had managed to make a marriage match and that her wedding would take place in a couple of weeks. He asked if the Baron would consider allowing her to take some leave in order to attend the festivities at home. If so, Laurent would be pleased to come and fetch her from the estate. When Camille presented this request to Antoine, he put down his book, gazed at her with a sad smile, and said, "Of course, she must go, and she should take all the time she needs." As she thanked him for giving his permission, she once again did not see a beast looking back at her. She only saw a man. She had to blink several times to dispel the illusion. As she left the room, she paused briefly, gazed at him again over her shoulder. Then she left him to his reading, putting the moment behind her. Her journey to and from her sister's wedding was uneventful. Family greeted her with much curiosity and perhaps some newfound respect. They admired the tasteful new clothes she acquired using her salary. It was obvious that the money she was sending to them had helped secure her sister's marriage. Humble though the match might be, her family was no longer seen by the villagers as being impoverished. Rather, they were viewed as being stable and acceptable, thanks to her regular income. And yet, Camille felt less at home in the family cottage than she once had. Although she had been contained inside the walls of the chateau this entire time, she felt like her worldview had changed and her horizons had vastly expanded. Seated around the fire with her siblings, who focused only on their own petty concerns, she felt stifled. She regretted having to leave her father again, but Camille also felt relief when he parted from her at the gates of Antoine's estate. She was ready to return to her life as mistress of the house. Her happiness, however, turned to dismay when she saw the disarray that awaited her. Gabriel answered the door eagerly, obviously delighted that she'd returned. He whispered to her that nothing had been the same since she'd laughed, and that the Baron was disheveled and did not leave his library. After putting away her things, Camille went straight to see Antoine. As she cautiously opened the door to the library, she found her room in a complete mess. Books were everywhere, lying open in stacks, generally tossed about. The floor, empty drinking glasses lined the tables. Antoine sat slumped in a chair, looking as if he hadn't changed his shirt in days. And the sound of her arrival. However, he looked up with an expression of sheepish relief. Once again, in this moment, Camille felt she only saw him as a regular man, and she struggled to adjust her view. She knew logically that she was standing before an unkempt, unshaven, and rather beastly person. However, her eyes were playing tricks. It took a moment before she saw him properly again. Yes, There he was in dire need of cheering up. It only took a few days for Camille to set everything right again. Dust and neglect of a couple of weeks were easily dealt with, and the Baron's mood improved instantly upon her return. Gabriel begged her in confidence, however, to go away again. He said the Baron had sunk immediately into the most terrible melancholy and had been completely useless about managing anything at all, including remembering to eat his meals. With spring blasting out all over the estate, it was impossible to be sad for long. Camille was delighted that she had taken the effort to clear the garden before winter. The courtyard looked absolutely beautiful, with the lovely plantings designed many years ago by Antoine's mother once again shining at their best. Flowers in a variety of colors delicately presented themselves, while the birds seemed to multiply daily, singing sweetly in the morning and inviting the chateau's residents to the garden. Camille and Antoine started spending afternoons reading outside in the pergola, and he often let Gabriel finish his tasks early so they could enjoy the afternoon with friends. Camille also enjoyed opening the windows of the stuffy mansion to air it out. Life throughout the estate began to feel fresh and new, as if the entire place had turned a corner. As summer approached, Camille received another message from her father informing her that her other sister was getting married again, and she was invited to the event. Camille felt torn. She felt obligated to be with her family for the wedding, but she couldn't bear the thought of leaving Antoine once more. Faced with this dilemma, she came up with a highly unusual plan. She proposed to Antoine that he should accompany her to the wedding, stay at an inn nearby. Antoine was shocked by the suggestion. "Have you not seen how people react to me?" he asked her. Camille had anticipated this and pointed out that her own village was far away, so people wouldn't have formed opinions about him based on rumors. Privately, Camille no longer saw him as a monster. She only saw the wise, kind man she had come to know. She believed that the people at home would give him a fair chance. The idea of a lord attending a village wedding didn't bother Camille at all. She had long stopped seeing Antoine as either a beast or a baron. Despite his resistance and reluctance, Camille insisted that she wouldn't go without him. Faced with the possibility of causing her to miss her sister's wedding, Antoine finally agreed. However, he seemed apprehensive and was in a somber mood as the preparations progressed. Camille was determined and sent Gabriel to the tailor in town to request a new, well-fitted suit for Antoine. She had noticed that he had been wearing outdated styles from decades ago. The current fashion trend was more refined and straightforward. She wanted him to have a dignified suit that would make him look less like a relic. Rooms in which we had been engaged were prepared, and the carriage was cleaned. Eventually, the day arrived when Gabriel bid the couple farewell on their journey. He had never witnessed the Baron leaving the estate before. He assured them that he would ensure everything remained in order until their return. The trip to Camille's village was swift by carriage, covering the distance in just one day, which happened to be a beautiful one. Summer was making its presence known with lush exuberance as the horse trotted down the road through the forest. The sun shone cheerfully through the canopy of leaves above them, casting bright rays of light onto the path ahead, softly whispering in the breeze. Initially, Antoine was silent, almost as if hesitating to accept the reality of accompanying Camille in public. However, after a few miles, he engaged in conversation about a book Camille had been reading. Soon, they were immersed in their usual lively exchange. Camille smiled to herself, witnessing his best qualities emerge. Observing him from the side, she could almost believe she was sitting next to a charming gentleman, content with that notion. She chose not to dispel the enchantment. Their pleasant journey eventually came to an end as twilight descended and the crickets began their nightly serenade in the fields. Antoine and Camille arrived at her family's cottage and stopped the carriage. As they descended from their seats, they were greeted by her entire family standing at the front door, with her 4 unmarried siblings staring at them both impolitely. Laurent made a more concerted effort to compose himself, stepping forward to greet Antoine with a nod, expressing gratitude for bringing Camille and honoring them with his visit. However, Camille felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment when her brother loudly whispered something to her older sister, causing the latter to giggle. It was evident to all that they were making jokes about the Baron. Everyone felt relieved when Antoine departed for his accommodations. Camille allowed herself to be led inside, where she spent the evening conversing with Laurent and her siblings, inquiring politely about the wedding preparations. She couldn't help but worry about how Antoine was faring at the inn, hoping he was not facing any mistreatment there. As she lay her head on the pillow that night, thoughts of him weighed heavily on her mind, lulling her to sleep. She realized she would be glad when they had gotten through this wedding and returned to the chateau, which she now felt was her real home. It was grim when he arrived at the church the next day for the wedding. It was obvious that Camille's fears had come true. They sat in silence during the ceremony, both feeling as if they were being stared at the entire time. The small church felt tiny, with a whole congregation scrutinizing them. The celebration afterward was on the village green. The party was simple but festive, with punch, cakes, and wild flowers. A cheerful atmosphere prevailed as ladies gathered in groups delicately eating sweets, while children tumbled across the lawn, enjoying an afternoon of play. Camille and Antoine, however, did not feel part of the celebration. She stood at his side stiffly, nodding to the villagers who had once been so kind to her, the welcoming people who had taught her to garden and bake years ago were now standing at a distance, whispering behind their hands and nodding knowingly in her direction. Not one neighbor had a polite word for Antoine, who smiled at all and said nothing. Her family was no help. They ignored the pair completely. As Camille and Antoine stood fervently wishing for the party to end, they overheard 2 men speaking nearby. "You may have money," one said with a smirk, "but he'll never convince anyone to marry him with a face like that." The other man laughed. "Sad state of affairs when you have to court your own maid," he responded. Those words were the last straw. Camille put down her punch and walked to the center of the gathering, tersely announcing that she had something to say and that everyone must listen. "I convinced the Baron to come with me because I thought you to be good people," she said. "I was sure that his fine character and his kindness would make it obvious to you all that he is not the beast people make him out to be. Well, I'm ashamed to say that I was wrong. None of you are worthy of his notice. We will trouble you no longer. Let me tell you this. Antoine is a better man than any other here. I would choose him as a companion over every single one of you 100 times over. And that's the truth. The company was completely silent, looking in bewilderment from Camille to Antoine and back again. As she turned to face him, she saw the strangest thing. Where he had stood, a handsome, dignified man stood, smiling gratefully in her direction. No matter how many times she tried to adjust her view, clear her head, his visage did not change. The excess of facial hair, the overly prominent features, and the massive proportions would not return. He was as handsome as any man she had ever known, and that remained unchanged. Whether it was a shift in perspective or the result of an enchantment, the other party guests carried on with their festivities as if nothing had occurred. They warmly greeted Antoine and smiled at Camille as if everything was normal. It was as if the embarrassing incident had never taken place. The villagers acted as though they had never before encountered a beast in their midst. It was both puzzling and miraculous. A veil had been lifted permanently. This quiet moment of triumph marked Antoine's release from the enchantment. For years, he had sought answers in his library, delving into human wisdom. However, he had misunderstood the woman who had cursed him. The lonely decades of growing kinder, more generous, and more forgiving had cultivated the humanity that had captured Camille's heart. This was the missing piece that had broken his curse. Shortly after, Camille and Antoine sat together beneath the pergola in his garden, admiring his mother's rosebush, which was once again blooming abundantly. Twilight descended upon the chateau, and the crickets emerged to serenade the world. As the happy couple savored the balmy summer evening, Camille admired the handsome face that had long been concealed behind the beastly facade. Observing him, she saw him sit up straighter and retrieve from his pocket the very ring she had secretly admired in his mother's dresser. "You were the only person who took the trouble to get to know me as I truly am," he said to her. Then, in his manner, he quoted from one of his numerous books. As Copernicus said, "In the middle of everything is the sun. You have become that sun." Winking at her, he added, "After all, I believe you have proven yourself more than capable of managing this chateau." Camille laughed and nodded in agreement, allowing him to slide the sparkling blue gem onto her finger. Gazing at it in wonder, she recalled the moment she had first laid eyes on it in the mysterious bedroom among the elegant dresses and other jewels. It sparkled in the sunlight as if conveying a precious secret. She was now becoming a part of the history of this house. Before the summer's end, Antoine and Camille exchanged their vows in the chateau's courtyard, surrounded by the heavenly fragrance of the blooming rose bushes and the sweet melodies of the birds in the treetops. Standing in the house's shadow, Camille looked at Antoine with a heart full of gratitude, feeling a deep sense of belonging in a place she had once found so unfamiliar. It was no longer the desolate place she had arrived at just a year ago. Through kindness, patience, and the pursuit of wisdom, she and Antoine had discovered happiness